The morning's skyline shattered as emergency sirens blared through the city, pulling thousands from their fragile routines into chaos. In the boardroom, Daniel Mercer said, "What the hell just happened?" His voice echoed against glass walls as screens flickered with breaking headlines. The empire he built trembled as whispers of scandal spread like wildfire across news outlets and social feeds, his image plastered with accusations he never saw coming. Panic coursed through his veins, but he clenched his jaw, masking dread behind a cold stare. Phones buzzed, assistants scrambled, and every glance in the room cut like knives, as if trust had evaporated in an instant. "Someone set this fire," he muttered, gripping the polished oak table with white knuckles. The betrayal struck harder than any market crash, leaving him exposed, surrounded, and alone. His rival's shadow loomed in every flashing update, each headline more damning than the last. Silence fell for a moment before another alarm wailed, piercing the room like a warning bell. It was no longer a company under siege, it was war. The boardroom descended into frantic debate, voices colliding as every executive demanded answers. Daniel Mercer said, "Quiet." His command cut through the chaos like a blade, silencing the storm. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with defiance. He felt their fear and betrayal like daggers pressing into his spine, yet he refused to bend. Claire Donovan tried to reason, whispering that trust was slipping away, but Daniel ignored her. Phones buzzed, screens refreshed, and suspicion poisoned the air as every ally became a potential traitor. He looked at each face, memorizing their fear, their greed, their uncertainty. "Who leaked this?" he demanded, his voice cracking the room's tension. No one spoke. A chilling silence spread, more terrifying than the alarms. In that silence, Daniel understood. The empire was fractured, and his enemies were already inside the walls. Behind closed doors, Daniel Mercer collapsed into his leather chair, the weight of the empire pressing down on his chest. He loosened his tie, staring blankly at a swirling glass of whiskey. "They want me gone," he whispered to himself, voice breaking. His reflection in the darkened window showed not a titan of industry, but a man cornered by shadows. Memories of battles won offered no comfort. This was different. This was betrayal. His phone buzzed with unanswered calls, each one a reminder that loyalty had a price, and someone had sold him out. For a fleeting second, he longed for solitude, for silence beyond the storm. But silence offered no escape. It only made the ticking clock louder, reminding him that time was running out and enemies were closing in. On every news channel, Edward Kane appeared calm, composed, and calculating. While Daniel fought panic, his rival smiled for the cameras. Edward said, "Stability matters, and leadership must be accountable." His words stung, not because of their truth, but because they dripped with poison disguised as reason. Crowds of investors and analysts nodded along, hungry for blood. Daniel saw the trap. Edward wasn't just attacking. He was positioning himself as savior. Every polished phrase stole another piece of Daniel's empire. Rage burned in Daniel's chest, but helplessness weighed heavier. For the first time in years, the empire he controlled was slipping from his grasp, and his rival's smirk told him it was deliberate, merciless, and unstoppable. As the day spiraled, the media storm grew ferocious. Headlines screamed accusations, social feeds spread rumors like wildfire, and investors demanded answers. Daniel Mercer stood at his office window, watching helicopters hover over his headquarters. Claire said, "We're losing control." Her voice was heavy with dread. Daniel clenched his fists, rage boiling beneath the surface, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion. Every story, every whisper, pushed him closer to collapse. He wanted to scream, but silence held him hostage. The empire he built was crumbling before his eyes, and the world wasn't watching for justice. They were watching for blood. He realized he wasn't just fighting for his company anymore. He was fighting for his survival. The boardroom turned into a crucible of suspicion, alliances crumbling under the weight of panic. Daniel Mercer said, "I built this empire and I won't watch it rot." His words drew nods from some, But others shifted uneasily, their silence louder than any protest. Claire Donovan whispered that enemies could already be among them, but Daniel refused to let fear dictate his command. The executives exchanged nervous glances, each one measuring loyalty against survival. Phones buzzed with news of plunging stocks, while whispers of takeover attempts seeped through. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as trust evaporated into smoke. Daniel locked eyes with each one, daring them to betray him openly. He needed to show strength, even as doubt gnawed at his bones. Outside, sirens wailed faintly, as though mocking the Empire's unraveling. The war had shifted from headlines to his very table, and no ally could be trusted. Daniel felt the sting of paranoia deepen when whispers of betrayal reached his ears. Claire Donovan leaned closer and said, "Someone here is feeding them information." Her words froze him, forcing his gaze across the table. Every face carried guilt, or at least the shadow of it. Silence felt like an admission, yet no one dared speak. An executive shifted in his seat, eyes darting to his phone, and Daniel's blood ran cold. The Empire's downfall wasn't only from outside attacks, it was bleeding from within. He forced himself to remain calm, though anger twisted inside like a blade. "Find the leak," he demanded, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. Claire tried to steady him, but her voice trembled too. The fractures in his inner circle widened, leaving Daniel to wonder not if betrayal would strike, but when. While Daniel fought chaos, Edward Kane emerged stronger than ever, his rival's polished smile beaming across every financial network. Edward said, "Leadership must be reliable, and investors deserve protection." The words dripped with venom wrapped in silk, each sentence pulling shareholders closer to his side. Daniel watched helplessly as his stock price plunged, a visible collapse of confidence. Crowds gathered outside headquarters, chanting, hungry for change. Edward positioned himself not as an enemy, but as the solution, a savior for those desperate to restore order. Daniel clenched his fists, his fury hidden behind glass walls, yet powerless against Edward's grip on the narrative. The rival's cunning was more dangerous than open warfare. It was a slow, deliberate theft of everything Daniel had built. Rumors spread like wildfire within the Empire's walls, whispered in corridors, and traded in private messages. Daniel Mercer stormed into his office and said, "Enough shadows. Show yourselves." His words rattled his assistant, who fumbled with files. Claire tried to calm him, but her eyes betrayed doubt. Somewhere in the chaos, the betrayer's silence remained louder than any excuse. Each corner of the building seemed infected with distrust, every conversation a potential knife in the back. Daniel's rage rose, but so did his paranoia, weaving a noose around his confidence. He realized the battlefield was no longer the market. It was his own halls, poisoned by fear. And someone hidden yet near was tightening the grip. By nightfall, Daniel sat in silence, the weight of suspicion crushing him. The once loyal faces of his executives replayed in his mind, each glance now suspect, each silence a betrayal. Claire said, "If trust dies here, everything dies with it." Her words struck deep, forcing him to confront the truth he dreaded. The war wasn't just outside, it had breached his inner walls. He stood by the window watching lightning split the night sky, the storm outside mirroring the chaos within. His empire was fractured, and he could no longer tell friend from foe. The realization struck with brutal clarity. Survival meant sacrifice, and someone close to him would have to fall before dawn. In the dim hum of the operations floor, secrets slithered through the cracks. A shadow moved quietly, carrying messages meant for Daniel's enemy. The corporate spy typed quickly, feeding Edward Kane the Empire's weakest points. Daniel Mercer said, "We are being gutted from the inside." His voice trembled with fury, his instincts clawing at the truth he couldn't yet prove. The hum of machines drowned out trust, every screen glowing like a betrayal waiting to be revealed. Somewhere among his own people, someone had chosen power over loyalty. Claire Donovan urged patience, whispering that paranoia would destroy him faster than any rival. But Daniel felt the walls closing in. His empire's blood was leaking, drop by drop, and he had no idea which hand held the knife. Inside his office, Daniel struggled with his instincts. Claire Donovan said, "If you accuse the wrong person, you'll lose everyone." Her words cut, reminding him of the fragile thread holding the empire together. He wanted to trust her, but doubt gnawed at his resolve. Every loyal face seemed painted with deception. The confidant leaned closer, her voice trembling as she pleaded for restraint. "You can't fight shadows," she whispered. Daniel slammed his fist onto the desk, papers scattering. He felt trapped, torn between his need for answers and his fear of losing the few allies left. The air in the office grew heavy, like betrayal itself was suffocating the room. Trust had become a weapon, and Daniel feared he was already bleeding from invisible wounds. The call came late, an unfamiliar number hidden behind layers of secrecy. A voice smooth and commanding echoed in Daniel's ear. The shadow investor said, "Your empire is not yours alone." Daniel froze, the words laced with control. This was no ally. This was a puppeteer. Claire Donovan entered mid-conversation, her expression pale as she realized the scale of manipulation. Daniel said, "Who are you?" But the line clicked dead before the answer came. The silence was deafening, leaving only the echo of power beyond his reach. He stared at the dark phone in his hand, realizing forces he could not see were pulling every thread. His empire wasn't just at risk, it was already being rewritten by invisible hands. Daniel walked the factory floor, once the heart of his empire, now poisoned by sabotage. Machines screeched, alarms blinked, and workers muttered in frustration. Claire said, "This isn't an accident." Her words pierced the noise. Daniel felt bile rise in his throat as he realized someone was tearing the foundation apart. Conveyor belts jammed, sparks flew, and production stalled while investors circled like vultures. Every second bled profit and credibility. He shouted orders, but his voice was drowned by chaos. The factory was no longer a symbol of power. It had become a battlefield. And Daniel knew sabotage this precise could only come from someone who knew the empire intimately. The revelation came like a blade twisting in his spine. Daniel stared across the dimly lit boardroom, at a face he once trusted. The betrayer stood silent, eyes unflinching, the truth heavy in the air. Daniel said, "It was you." His words cracked, carrying pain heavier than rage. The betrayer's smirk confirmed the nightmare. Loyalty had been sold. Claire gasped softly, her hands trembling as she realized their walls were breached. The empire was not collapsing by chance. It was being dismantled from within by someone he had called an ally. Daniel's chest tightened, rage colliding with heartbreak. The war was no longer against a rival. It was against betrayal born at his very table. The empire was bleeding, but Daniel refused to surrender. He gathered his closest advisors late into the night, the boardroom lit only by the glow of screens. Daniel said, "We strike back now, or we're finished." His words hung heavy, the desperation hidden behind iron resolve. Claire Donovan urged caution, warning that haste could destroy what little ground they had left. Daniel's jaw tightened, his voice low but fierce, as he outlined a counter-strategy to choke Edward Kane's advance. Executives shifted uneasily, fear written across their faces. Every option meant sacrifice, every decision risked collapse. The air stank of stale coffee and sweat, yet the tension was sharper than steel. Daniel knew he wasn't leading men anymore. He was commanding survivors in a war with no retreat. Edward Kane struck back with merciless precision. On live television, he announced an aggressive bid to seize Daniel's company, his silver smile dripping with triumph. Edward said, "Leadership must be earned, not clung to." The words hit Daniel like a hammer, each phrase crafted to poison investors against him. The broadcast turned Kane into a savior, and Daniel into a relic. Rage coursed through Daniel's veins as he smashed the remote against his desk, the screen shattering but not silencing the enemy's voice. Claire whispered that Kane's timing was perfect, too perfect to be coincidence. The trap had been set long before, and now the jaws were closing. For the first time, Daniel felt the empire slipping entirely out of his grasp. The storm of betrayal summoned a ghost from Daniel's past. Richard Hale, the disillusioned mentor, stepped into the office, a man once feared and now forgotten. His eyes carried the weight of failure, his voice rasping like gravel. Richard said, "Ambition will consume you as it consumed me." Daniel bristled, unwilling to hear sermons, but the words sank like stones in his chest. Claire stood silently, recognizing the pain etched into Richard's face. The old man warned that power was fleeting, that loyalty was an illusion, and that survival required sacrifice. Daniel hated him for being right. He realized his empire's fall was not unique. It was the curse of every empire built on ambition. Among the chaos, a voice long ignored began to rise. Emily Carter, the underdog executive, stepped forward with trembling resolve. She had been underestimated for years, but now her quiet determination pierced the storm. Emily said, "We can rebuild, but not with fear." The room fell silent, Daniel studying her with surprise. Behind her modest words burned a fire he hadn't noticed before. Claire's eyes softened, recognizing the power in Emily's voice. For the first time, Daniel saw a spark of hope not born from dominance, but from resilience. Yet he also knew hope alone couldn't save them. Every spark risked being smothered by the storm. The boardroom erupted, accusations flying like arrows as alliances shattered. Executives shouted over each other, their voices drowning in chaos. Daniel Mercer slammed the table, shouting, "Enough!" But his command no longer carried the weight it once did. Edward Kane's poison had spread too deeply. Claire tried to mediate, but the storm raged beyond her voice. Emily Carter stood silent, her eyes burning as she witnessed the collapse. Daniel realized control was slipping, not in sudden betrayal, but in the slow erosion of authority. The empire wasn't stolen, it was decaying from within. And no strategy could stop rot once it spread through every wall. The truth struck like lightning. The betrayer was no phantom but the man Daniel trusted most. The CFO revealed his treachery with a smirk, his betrayal more cutting than any enemy's strike. Daniel said, "You sold us out." His voice broke, trembling with rage. The betrayer leaned back, smug, his silence louder than any denial. Claire gasped, her eyes wide with devastation. The weight of betrayal crushed Daniel's chest, his empire reduced not by rivals but by the hands of his own. Loyalty had been an illusion, and now its collapse left only ruin. The knife twisted deeper when family ties surfaced. Daniel discovered the betrayer had ties to his own blood, an old relative secretly bankrolling the rival's move. The revelation cracked his soul. Claire said, "They were never yours to trust." Her voice was heavy with pity. Daniel staggered, struggling to breathe as betrayal expanded beyond business into blood. He realized ambition had poisoned everything, even the sanctity of family. The empire wasn't only falling, it was being devoured from the inside, leaving nothing sacred. The shadow investor returned, unseen yet omnipresent, manipulating both sides with ruthless precision. A letter arrived without a signature, detailing demands that placed Daniel in chains, regardless of choice. Daniel said, "They're not choosing sides, they're pulling every string." Claire's voice trembled as she read aloud the demands, her hands shaking. It was no longer a battle between two men. It was theater, with invisible hands controlling every act. Daniel's rage turned to dread as he realized the empire wasn't just under siege. It was property and a game played by giants unseen. Edward Kane struck his most devastating blow, unleashing a public attack that left Daniel's empire gasping for air. Kane's words painted Daniel as corrupt, incompetent, and unworthy. Daniel slammed his fists on the table, roaring, "Lies!" But his fury couldn't silence the storm outside. Protesters filled the streets, investors withdrew, and the media feasted on blood. Claire's voice cracked as she begged him to endure, but Daniel's rage consumed him. The empire he had built was no longer admired, it was condemned. The walls he once ruled from now echoed with jeers from the world outside. Alone in the silence of his office, Daniel understood the final truth. Trust was gone, allies were gone, and betrayal had hollowed his empire to its core. Claire said, "This fight has already cost more than victory could ever repay." Her words echoed like a requiem. Daniel stared into the night, realizing survival meant sacrificing everything that once defined him. His reflection stared back, a man not of triumph, but of ruin. He whispered, "This war is mine to finish." The storm raged beyond the glass, but inside, a darker storm burned within him. Daniel sat in the dim silence of his office, the storm outside hammering against glass like an executioner's drum. He pressed his palms against his temples, the empire's weight crushing him from within. Daniel whispered, "I can't hold this together anymore." His chest burned, his breath shallow, as years of victories felt hollow in the face of betrayal. Claire entered quietly, her voice low with worry as she said, "You breaking." He snapped back, "I don't break." But his trembling hands betrayed him. In that moment, Daniel wasn't a titan, he was a man unraveling. Every failure, every knife in his back, carved pieces away until he was a hollow shell of ambition, clinging to power by threads too thin to hold. Claire stood firm when Daniel faltered, her loyalty tested beyond limits. She said, "Let me carry this weight." Her words shook with emotion, but her eyes burned with resolve. Daniel stared at her, torn between gratitude and fear, knowing her sacrifice might be the last tether keeping him alive. Claire placed a folder on the desk, evidence she had gathered at great risk, her hands trembling from the burden. Daniel whispered, "You'll be destroyed." She replied, "Then let it be me, not you." In that instant, Daniel saw the true cost of loyalty, not victory, not survival, but sacrifice. Amid ruin, an unexpected voice rose. Emily Carter stepped forward again, her resolve sharper than before. Emily said, "If no one will stand, then I will." Daniel's weary eyes met hers, surprised by the fire within her. She outlined a plan, raw but bold, to strike where Cain least expected. Claire watched with silent pride, recognizing the underdog's rise. For the first time, Daniel saw hope in someone else's strength. Yet it wounded him too, to know salvation came from a voice he had long overlooked. Emily's determination reminded him that power did not always roar. It could whisper until it became impossible to ignore. The betrayer and Edward Cain pressed their advantage, circling like wolves scenting blood. In secret meetings, they prepared their final strike. Cain said, "Tomorrow we end him." The betrayer smirked, his silence sealing the pact. Daniel felt their presence closing in, the air around him heavy with inevitability. Every corridor whispered treachery. Every screen showed Cain's rising dominance. Claire warned, "They're not waiting anymore." Daniel clenched his fists, his rage barely masking despair. He had lost battles before, but never like this. Tomorrow, he knew, would decide not just the empire, but his very soul. Daniel stood alone at the center of the boardroom, fists clenched, his voice echoing in the empty space. He whispered, "I will not fall." Though his empire crumbled, his last reserves of willpower ignited within him. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating his silhouette like a warrior before battle. Claire entered, quietly placing her hand on his shoulder. Emily Carter appeared behind her, standing strong. For the first time, Daniel was not alone in his defiance. The storm outside mirrored the storm within, but he embraced it. Tomorrow would be their reckoning, and Daniel Mercer swore he would fight until the very end. The final battle erupted in the boardroom, the Empire's fate balanced on a knife's edge. Edward Cain strode in with legal armies at his back, his smile sharp as steel. Daniel said, "This is still my house." His voice thundered across the hall, echoing like defiance against the inevitable. The betrayer stood at Cain's side, his silence a dagger deeper than words. Claire held her breath, knowing this was the moment where everything would either burn or be reclaimed. Emily Carter whispered, "We still have a chance." Daniel straightened, his spine unbroken, ready for war. The clash had begun. The mask shattered, as the betrayer revealed himself fully, his smirk curling into open contempt. Daniel shouted, "You were my brother in arms." The betrayer sneered, replying, "I was always for myself." The words carved through Daniel like fire. Claire's gasp echoed in the silence, her eyes filled with grief. Emily clenched her fists, her fury silent but fierce. The boardroom walls seemed to close in, betrayal bleeding across every corner. Daniel's empire hadn't been destroyed by rivals. It had been murdered by trust. A twist cut deeper than any blade. As the battle raged, Claire discovered evidence that the shadow investor had orchestrated the betrayal from the start, pulling strings to pit them all against each other. Claire said, "This was never just about us, it was their game." Daniel froze, his anger twisting into horror. Kane faltered, realizing he too had been manipulated. For the first time, enemies and allies alike understood they were pawns. The revelation shattered every certainty. The war was no longer between Daniel and Kane. It was against an unseen hand that owned them both. The climax reached its peak, voices exploding in rage, accusations clashing like swords. Daniel and Kane locked eyes, both men broken yet unwilling to yield. Daniel shouted, "This ends now," as lightning struck outside, thunder shaking the walls. Kane retorted, "You've already lost." The betrayer leaned back, smirking as chaos erupted across the table. Claire's voice strained as she tried to hold ground, while Emily stepped forward, demanding justice. The air burned with fury, ambition, and ruin. In that moment, survival came at a price none of them could afford. Silence followed the storm, heavy as death. The boardroom lay in ruins, papers scattered, voices broken. Daniel stood at the window, his reflection fractured by raindrops. Claire whispered, "It's over." But Daniel's hollow eyes betrayed no relief, only loss. Emily stood behind him, defiant but solemn. The betrayer vanished into the shadows, his smirk echoing like a ghost. Edward Kane left without victory, his silence heavier than defeat. Daniel whispered, "I won the war, but lost my soul." The words hung like ash. The empire stood, but Daniel Mercer was gone, replaced by a hollow king standing among ruins.